الحزب الشيوعي الأميركي. نعم، ما سمعته صحيح، فهناك حزب شيوعي أمريكي. ليس هذا فحسب، بل إن الحزب تأسس عام 1919 بعد أن سبقته حركة شيوعية قوية في الولايات المتحدة منذ عام 1865، أي قبل أكثر من 40 عاماً من اندلاع الثورة البلشفية في روسيا. الجزيرة نت كان لها لقاء متفرد مع زعيم الحزب سيمز، وهو اللقاء الأول معه على مدار عقود، حيث واجه الحزب عبر تاريخه تعتيماً إعلامياً، وذلك بعد سنوات من اضطهاد أعضائه. سيمز الذي تولى زعامة الحزب منذ عام 2019 تحدث إلى الجزيرة نت حول تاريخ كل من الحركة الشيوعية في الولايات المتحدة وحزبها الذي ولد في نفس عام انتهاء الحرب العالمية الأولى.
Mr. Sims, thank you very much for talking to Al Jazeera.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having us.
Although the U.S. Communist Party have been in this country since the late 19th century, even before the Bolshevik Revolution took place, how did that part of the country's history drop out? And do you think that the movie industry, media, and the literature played a role in this?
Well, we didn't drop out. We were pushed out. You're right. The party and the left, the Marxist part of the labor movement, has played has a long and storied history in the United States, going all the way back to actually around the time of the Civil War. Mm-hmm. There was a general who was a good friend of Karl Marx who fought on the side of the Union against the slavery. And then throughout the history up to the time of the Cold War and Winston Churchill's speech, I believe it was in 1946 or 47, in Fulton, Missouri, where he made that famous declaration about the Iron Curtain. Since that time, there has been a conscious attempt to push the party and other movements on the left to the margins of U.S. society. It took the form of political repression. We were sent to jail during the McCarthy period for the charge of teaching, conspiring to teach Marxism, conspiring to violently overthrow and advocate the overthrow of the U.S. government, which we hadn't done, by the way. Our leadership was jailed. We were pushed out of the unions, you know.
You're talking about the 50s and
I'm
the
talking
60s.
about the 1950s. We were pushed out of the unions, you know. The unions adopted anti-communist clauses, so you could not hold an elected office in a trade union if you were a member of the party. And that lasted up until, in the AFL-CIO, up until the time that Whippensinger became the president of the AFL-CIO. People were fired, you know, from their jobs. I come from a small town in Ohio, Youngstown. It was a steel-producing city, and heard many stories about it happened to my family. Mm-hmm. My grandmother, who was not a member of the party, but who was a left-wing, progressive, civil rights fighter, called before the House Un-American Activities Committee twice. Mm-hmm. My mother as well, you know, and we were teased as children. Your parents are communists. You're communists, and so on and so forth. And that kind of repression, that isolation, lasted up until the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, because anti-communism and anti-Sovietism was a big industry in the United States. And you asked about the movies and film and the cultural institutions in the United States. And indeed, that was part of it. You know, the left in the film industry also pushed out, you know. There was a very famous trials of the Hollywood 10. A number of actors and directors and playwrights boycotted, blackballed. Well, accused, whether they were or whether they weren't wasn't the point. The point was to instill fear into the life of cultural workers so that they wouldn't continue to.
You're talking about the time when Edgar Hoover headed the FBI, right?
Exactly. And Hoover had that job up through, I don't know what were the 70s, you know, up until the time he died. And he persecuted not only us, but the likes of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X. There was a persecution of the Black Panther Party, the anti-war movement, you name it. Hoover didn't like it, it was, and it felt that it was a threat to the status quo. It was repressed, and sometimes violently, as in the case of the attack on the Black Panther Party, you know. So that's why we are in a situation, and there was a conscious choice on the part of the editorial boards of the major newspapers and television and so on and so forth to not allow us a voice in the mass media, you know? And so you could write letters to the editor of the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune or the San Francisco Chronicle or whatever, and they wouldn't be published. You know, there was a conscious decision to censor the voices of the left, and you know, free speech in this country is for many decades now is dependent on the capital that you have in order to make that speech publicized. And if you don't have the capital, you really don't have the speech.
Then how can the party and other left movements effectively deliver their message in the face of such limited media coverage and the negative stereotypes?
Well, it's a tough job. It's a tough job, and we have to produce our own press, you know, and that's what we've been doing for many years. We have our own newspaper. Well, it's not a paper anymore. It's produced online. Print is, as you know, prohibitively expensive. We have our own YouTube shows, you know, and so we have to generate our own mass media, you know.
And of course, recently, making use of the social media.
And to make use of social media, of course, on YouTube, on Instagram, Facebook, and so on and so forth. But it's an uphill battle.
How can the party and the left wing work to build broader coalition to increase their political reach?
Well, coalitions, what we call united front work, is I think the central point of departure of our work. And that coalition work has to be based on the issues and problems that the working people in this country face, whether it be on the issue of health care, or whether it be on the issue of the right to strike, or gun violence, or drugs, police repression, you know. When problems develop in our communities or in the workplace or on the campuses, we have to work with those affected and the organizations that they belong to address those issues. And so that is the staple of the party's work.
What are the most common misconceptions you encounter about the party, and how do you address these misconceptions in your encounter with the public?
Well, I would say that for many years, the biggest misconception was that the party was a foreign import. Mm-hmm. That is to say that we were the product of a movement from another country, mm-hmm. principally the Soviet Union, mm-hmm. you know. And that idea was one of the principal attacks that was used against us during the Cold War. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, that charge has dropped, and now I would say that the biggest misconception is that the party is against democracy. Mm-hmm. That we favor a system which is based on repression. Mm-hmm. That there's no free speech.
We'll get to that point later.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Could you briefly outline the historical role of the party in the U.S. presidential elections?
Well, we fielded presidential candidates throughout, you know, much of our history, you know.
I think the last one was
the last one was in the 80s. The
Yeah.
last one was in the 80s at Gus Hall and Angela Davis was our standard bearers. And around that time, there was a big shift to the right in the Republican Party.
You're talking about the Reagan era.
I'm talking about the Reagan era,
Yeah.
and we were very concerned that the movement towards fascism was accelerating, and you saw the sprouts of what we now have with the MAGA movement in the Republican Party. Those seeds were sown at that time. And so we decided to suspend our presidential campaigns, what we had thought then would be temporarily, in order to focus on defeating that right-wing threat. Unfortunately, we have not managed to mount a presidential campaign since, because it's very difficult now in the United States for third parties to contest successfully in the electoral sphere. Mm-hmm. You know, the election system is kind of shut down by the laws which were approved by the Democratic and Republican parties. And so, for example, in order to get on the ballot, you have to collect a certain number or percentage of signatures in each state. Mm-hmm. In California, for example, it used to, I remember because I worked on the campaign for Gus and Angela, mm-hmm. and prior to that for Jarvis Tyner and Gus Hall, you had to collect, I don't know, 200,000-300,000 signatures, which meant that you had to really collect 400,000 or 600,000 because you had to collect twice the number, mm-hmm. in order to ensure that you had enough valid mm-hmm. signatures. Yeah. And so to do that in each state successfully requires a lot of people with petitions, mm-hmm. and requires a lot of money and so on and so forth. And so, which raises the need for radical reform of the electoral system, mm-hmm. so that other parties, not just ours, can compete in the electoral process. And then it's been made even more difficult several years ago when the Supreme Court made a decision, it's called Citizens United, which allowed unlimited spending by corporations in the election process. And so one of the things that we need in order to address that is public financing of the elections to prevent the corporations from having undue influence.
So do you think it's almost next to impossible for the party to field any future candidates for presidential elections?
You know, Nelson Mandela has a saying that I'm very fond of, which is that nothing is impossible until it's done. Mm-hmm. And so, no, I don't think it's impossible. I think that one of the things that the party is emphasizing now is the need for us to field candidates. Mm-hmm. We've been making that point now for several years. And we're going to start at the local level, mm-hmm. you know, for city council, for school board, you know, for...
That was my next question, actually.
Okay, well...
What is the party's strategy to build political power at the local and state levels?
Well, here the issue is to root ourselves in the communities, in the neighborhoods, around the day-to-day problems that working people are facing. On the basis of that, again, to build coalitions, and those coalitions must also take the form of electoral coalitions, because in order to successfully bid for office, you have to build a coalition, mm-hmm. you know, and we are now at the stage of beginning to organize that kind of electoral work after suspending it for a few decades, you know, mm-hmm. Because the focus was working in and through the Democratic Party and supporting their efforts to defeat Republican right-wing mm-hmm. candidates. Mm-hmm. But that kind of strategy will only take you so far, you mm-hmm. know, as we saw in the last election.
Mm-hmm. In light of the figures that show that the top 1% hold 32% of U.S. wealth, while the bottom 50% hold about 2%, how does this impact working class Americans? And what do you think is the reason that perpetuates this economic disparity?
There is rage in the country among working people about wealth inequality, you know. And it has grown tremendously over the last couple of decades, you know. And the anger is one of the things that anger is one of the things that contributed to Trump's election, because the Republicans portrayed themselves as the friend of working people, you know. And I think that...
You don't believe so?
Huh?
You don't believe so?
Well, you know, if you saw the inauguration, you saw Trump standing in front at the podium, and behind Trump was his family. And behind Trump's family were 13 billionaires and who were sitting in front of Trump's cabinet. There wasn't one worker or trade unionist in the house, you know? Mm-hmm. So, you know, no, Trump is the most anti-union, anti-labor president in recent memory, maybe in the history of the country. But they were able to successfully channel that anger among certain sections of the working class, not the entire working class, you know. Most African Americans didn't vote for Trump. Most Latinos didn't vote for Trump. Most Asians didn't vote for Trump. And big sections of the white working class population didn't vote for Trump. Not a majority, but you know, upwards of 40%. So no, not a friend of working people. And that wealth disparity, to go back directly to your question, has developed because the playing field in the United States has been set and determined by big business, you know. And unfortunately, there's been the notion which has been put forward that somehow that wealth will trickle down, you know. That was the Republicans' mantra, trickle down economics, you know. But the money didn't come down. It trickled up, and that's where it's going to stay. The healthcare system is a for-profit system. I think that we have to break up and put in public hands the big banks. We have to change the election system across the country.